Hello, folks, and welcome back to another Hallowoods weekly Q&A behind-the-scenes live stream extravaganza affair. Thank you so much for tuning in, as always, not only to these behind-the-scenes snippets, but to the show in general. We are rolling towards the end of our fourth season for Hello from the Hallowoods, although it will not be much of a break between seasons, as we are looking at coming back, at least in some capacity, for Halloween. That said, this will be our final Q&A live stream of this season, as essentially this is pretty close to the end of work for season four. You still have two more episodes left coming up shortly this week and then the week after, but behind the scenes, these are nearly done, and that will kind of conclude our work on this season, so to speak. So this is our final Q&A for this chunk of Q&As that have accompanied season four. And then we'll be looking at a short break of a couple weeks and then back in for season five relatively soon. So it is huge to be here at the end of season four. It definitely has been a lot of work over the last many months to kind of piece it together. And it's been so much fun to return to the story after sort of our longer break between seasons three and four. And it's been lovely to get to sort of refresh and ignite some curiosity, and the receptions about the season from the audience have been wonderful. Thank you so much to everyone who has followed along, posted their sort of weekly episode responses, made fan art, written fan fiction, um, and especially to the folks who post their like audio drama, what I listened to this week reports. It's all amazing to see, and it's so invigorating for audio drama creators to get to see that kind of response happening out there. So, thank you so much for tuning in to season four. And I'm glad that although it has been, I think, our most controversial season yet, definitely it has had a polarizing effect on the audience a little bit. But I'm thrilled to see that, and I'm glad that a couple of seasons in, the Hallowoods is able to continue surprising and doing some stretching its creative capacity and potential, even if that means leading in directions that are not always popular or not always like unanimously enjoyed. It at least means that it is continuing to do something else to stretch boundaries, to try and just continue pushing the creative envelope for the show. So I'm glad to see that this season has continued to do that. So that said, the way these Q and A's work, I have a number of Q and A questions that patrons have submitted. Every Hallowoods patron has access in Patreon, in the descriptions of all these Q and A's, to a special patrons only ask box where people can submit questions that get answered on these streams. They can submit at any time, and all of them get answered in the next sort of upcoming Q and A. Any that you submit over the break probably will get answered in a Q&A in season five when we return to scheduling these. In the meantime, if you're watching this in the real time present day, you are able to click over to the YouTube side. There's like a chat sidebar. Feel free to drop questions in there if you like. And after I've gotten through all the ones in the patron ask box, then I'll be happy to sort of click over to the YouTube side and answer any questions that have come up in the chat. So I will answer as many as I can in this being our sort of last Q&A for the season. After this, I'll be taking really just some, not even break time, but just planning time for working on season five and getting the first new episodes sorted and written and recorded, and kind of begin production for that. So in the meantime, we do have questions, which I am thrilled to see. Starting with, and I am trying to. I don't think I've answered this question before. No, I haven't. Excellent. Lindsay asks, in future seasons, what are some dynamics / character interactions you'd love to flesh out? Also, going off of that, what are some dynamics that you wish you could revisit / who are some characters that you think would provide interesting interactions? There's a lot of questions wrapped up in this one. So I think, and as we come to the end here, probably some spoilers for season 4, or at least in this case, some character names. But character dynamics, interactions, I'd love to flesh out. There's a lot. There's a lot. But especially here in season 4, we're looking at characters that a lot of new characters that haven't really gotten their time in the spotlight yet, or haven't really gotten their time to shine. So I think the chance to let more of those characters just get to interact, to spend some time with the audience, to start showing off who they are a little bit more, all of that is excellent for just getting to take those characters from that very early sort of first concept stage, and then they tend to get more and more fleshed out as the show goes on. So there are a number out of season 4 that I think. I mean, the thing is though, the season 5 is right around the bend, so we're likely to get a lot more time in development with all of these characters. But there are a number of fairly cool characters, I think. Ignatius and Oswin. I'd love to get Tuck was here for all of 3 stories in season 4. I would love to get more time with them. And I think as far as interactions go, there's a number of characters that I look forward to getting to dig into their relationship a little bit more. Milo and Navinus, not only with each other, but with all of Scout City, really. There's kind of an interesting role that those two play within the scope of how the city has evolved. And for Russell and Al, I really like, the current groundskeeper crew, or Russell and Arnold. I really like the current groundskeeper crew. So, but there's a lot of other characters and dynamics that I would also love to continue that aren't on the table just yet. In which I guess leads into what dynamics do we wish we could revisit? I think there's a number of characters that haven't been on the table this season in the same way. We haven't been tuned into what they're up to. Friday and Penny have been busy. The Downing Hill is sort of Harrow is off looking for that, and possibly finding it, and possibly entangled in the complications of it. There's a whole coven of Blackwood witches that haven't been seen in the modern era yet. Moth and Ray haven't been sort of around here in season 4. So there's a number of our older characters from these past seasons that I'm really looking forward to getting to continue to explore, as eventually we just continue the process of getting to find where the story left them and what the ensuing years have meant, and what that kind of where their place in life has changed to in the modern day. So there's a lot that we'll get to explore as time goes on, and the next 2 seasons roll out. So I'm very much looking forward to that. We have a question from Lizard. Lizard asks, following last week's episode, I guess, hefty. I'll to avoid spoiling too much exactly the last contents of the previous episode. I will say, following last week's episode, how long were you planning the events of last week's episode? I think that has been the case since the start of the season. And I mean, really, that probably comes back to maybe a month or two after the end of season 3, plotting out just after we've arrived at our current place in the story, what exactly the next evolution is going to look like. There were certain things that I had vaguely in mind at the end of season 3, but some of these finer details really come together once it's time to sit down and pencil out in more detail the next stage of the story. And so for Clementine and Riot's storyline, especially, that was something that has been sort of receiving a lot of thought over the last many months, especially because keep in mind all of the guest lines for the show for this season, with my sister Libby, who is the voice of Clementine, with Evan Michael Lee, who is the voice of Meryl Marr, and with Jimmy Yamaguchi, who is the voice of the Auditor. All of these lines were sort of written and recorded and done before the start of this season, because all that guest work needs to happen so much further in advance. And so I think the direction for some of these things was pretty set in from the start. And in some cases, it's just been the question of how we get from point A to point B that begins to sort of settle and find its way home during the season itself, which is kind of I guess the duality or the challenge of both like writing this huge long-term story, but then also at the same time making it up week to week because it is written week to week. I am writing an episode per week, and episodes are coming out weekly. And so even when I'm ahead, there is still this very sort of real-time crafting of the work that is happening as it rolls out. So with that said, yeah, it is often for these things, the general image or the general plan will be in place for months and months ahead of time. And then the exact details of how everything falls, because they're so influenced by the exact details of what gets written in the episodes leading up to that, often will sort of change or find their often I'll go in without knowing the exact details of how everything is going to break down. And then over the course of the season, that path will kind of become clear. And often it will take a little bit of a different turn or a little bit of a different direction than I necessarily anticipated at the start. I don't think Vincent had much of a role in this season as I had pictured it months and months ago. But then just over the course of the writing began to find oh, this incidental Undertaker character actually, I think there is a cool story and a cool part of the season to be explored there. And so there is kind of an organic discovery that happens in the writing process for the Hallowoods, as much as the audience, is sort of listening week to week and getting the end result. Indigo asks, good afternoon. This season, I've really enjoyed seeing what became of so many of the characters from the first 3 seasons and meeting so many great new ones. Was there anything in the series so far that hasn't gone the way you originally planned? It's a good question. I think for originally planned, I think most things, just in the sense that originally, when seasons are initially thought of, it is like a 1-sentence description. And then it's a slow process of breaking that 1-sentence description of what the theme or the purpose of that season is, breaking that down into how many episodes we're going to get and what are kind of the rises and falls and what are the big story beats that need to happen and how do those break down. And it's a constant process of sort of adding more detail until it gets to the step of actually writing that episode. And knowing before it gets written a pretty good idea of what the sort of contents and what the place of that episode is. So I think this season has really been a fun one to do because so many characters are not exactly where we left them between seasons. They've had an opportunity to take this time for themselves to build a life, to do things. Their positions in the world have often changed. And so that has meant that nearly every character is somewhere that I wouldn't necessarily have sort of thought about or planned, like back, midway through season 2, for instance. But looking back over the time period between season 3 and 4, there's a lot of fun that comes from trying to figure out, okay, we left this character at the end of season 3. They were in this state. What would they do in that time? What else would they get up to? What have the ensuing years sort of served to them? What kind of challenges would they have overcome in that time? And so that's led to a lot of the fun kind of findings of current characters, and just getting to see where they've landed later on, especially as the world around them also does not remain static. But the world around them is rapidly changing. And so trying to figure out how they would have tried to navigate that, and sort of what would logically make some sense for where they've ended up, based on their trajectory in those first early seasons. So I think it is almost always a little bit unexpected, but it's also a source of a lot of fun for trying to figure that out and trying to, even when the result is kind of surprising. Stonks in the chat says hi. Lindsay in the chat says, thank you so much for answering all those questions. I'm excited to see where the story goes. Me too. Me too. It is always one of those things, and Femme Fatale says hello. Hello back. It's one of those things where the overall arc and plan for the seasons is fairly solid. I think there is a purpose for each season existing. There is like a broad strokes sort of foundation for it, but the fine details are always something that gets to happen pretty much in this stage where, one season is ending, the next is beginning. And so it's now the question of how does all the fallout from this season directly inform the next chapter of the story. So there, frankly, is a lot of fine details and world building and plot developing that's going to happen over these next few weeks as we begin to roll into just full-time production for season 5. Beanie in the chat says hello. So I think I have one or two last questions in the patrons ask box, then I will get to any that we have in the chat. So please drop questions in the chat if you like. I will answer them shortly. Let's see. So I think our last question comes from Grim in the patrons ask box. What made you decide to study and work in marketing before making Hallowoods? Based on how you talk about it and its role in the show, it doesn't seem something you would go for today. It's a very good question. So very, 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 very astute. So, essentially, I think my original line of thinking when I was looking at university degrees to get was I didn't want to get something that would cost $100,000, which was animation degrees. That was originally what I was looking at. And so, in the absence of not doing things that cost $100,000, I knew that I was kind of a flighty creative who did not get projects done. So I thought that if I was going to go to school and learn a skill set, the hope would be that it would be something that would provide some sort of real world skill or useful set of tools so that I would have the capacity to work at some kind of qualified job if my creative projects weren't going anywhere. And especially at the time, I hadn't really dipped my toes into writing for a while. I had made several animation pitches that didn't work out for Frederator. And so I didn't have a lot of discipline as a creative, and I didn't have really the tool set to plan out projects in a realistic way, to do my research about a niche or an industry, or try to figure out like how to make a project sustainable. I had no idea about any of this. So I went for a degree, a 2-year degree in business marketing. And during that degree, I began to realize several things. I had just gotten into it because business sounded useful, and then marketing sounded like there were some creative aspects to it, as opposed to like business accounting or something, or HR. So I got into marketing, and then it was a useful time, and I think still a very useful degree, because it taught me a lot of things that have kind of provided the complement to my creative work. I learned how to manage projects. I learned how to set deadlines. I learned, even just through the process of going to school itself, beyond the actual subject matter, learned how to get projects done. Learned how to sort of create a process to get something done. And through the business side, I was able to learn, okay, how do you balance accounts? How do you know what to charge for things? How do you value your time? How do you, if you're going to try and crowdfund something, how does that work? And so all of that was very, very useful in what would eventually be like actual creative pursuits. But during that, I also began to learn that marketing is something I had never really thought about before. And I think most people don't. And it's so subliminal at this point, and so intrinsically a part of living in like a capitalist sort of society. You just don't blink when you look up and you see like advertising on the bus. You almost don't even think about the fact that it is there, like that on the top rows and the bus corners or the subway car corners. There are ads. And I had never really even thought about them being there, much less that those ads were chosen by groups of marketers because they have looked at where the correct demographic for their product lives and where the demographic for their product works in the city. And so they put ads in particular bus or subway lines based on the populations that are usually taking that transit for their commute. I had no idea that so many people were out there sitting at a table trying to think how they could take advantage of your life to sell you stuff. The fact that this is, it's not just on public transit, but it is the job of every marketer on social media. It's a question of how do you take advantage of people's psychology to get them to click on a link to go to a web page to opt in for a lead funnel. It is a complex game of drawing people into a web. And it was particularly influenced by some of my marketing teachers, one of whom had the exact cadence of Lady Ethel Mallory. And half of Lady Ethel's dialogue in that first season of the Hallowoods is just verbatim what came out of those marketing lectures. I would jot down notes and I would start to, even on the margins of my school notebooks at that time, it was, early Hallowoods characters were starting to appear as doodles. And so a number of characters appeared during that time. I during a creative writing exercise group I began to get back into writing as well, and back into realizing that was something I'd missed a lot throughout my years, and something I really wanted to invest in trying to do. Um, and so by the end of it, I was kind of firmly, of several beliefs, which is that that the business skills I learned were extremely useful for trying to operate as a professional, but at the same time, that marketing, I think, can be a deeply unethical field, and it's a field that's not really patrolled. Like, there are internet ethics committees, but there's so much that marketers get away with because people are able to just click on a single checkbox for terms and conditions, and they don't necessarily. Nobody, rarely do we ever read them. And the cost of not agreeing is not being able to use the entire internet, pretty much. Um, so that said, it's a very complex field, and although I did work immediately after school for marketing, this entrepreneur coaching and that sort of thing, I began to find as time went on that it was just an unsettling and unfulfilling line of work, and specifically something I really wanted to escape and get out of. So it is still a skill set I have. I've been able to, at least try and manage my own projects a little bit using that. But there's an ethical component that I think would stop me from working a lot of marketing jobs going forward. Um, so it definitely took a little while, I think, for the Hallowoods to ramp up to a point where it was sort of not quite an equivalent income, but enough to sort of scrape by just by itself. Um, and so that move, I think, was deeply worth it to get out of that line of work and then be able to sort of write and storytell and do really creative projects full time. And that is something that requires a lot of effort, and often, like, there's a need to do additional side projects, or take on contracting work, or take up like extra inventions to try and figure out how to get bills paid for that month. But I would much rather be doing that than, like, in a very cushy but kind of soul killing marketing gig. So that is the short answer to that. For the chat, I do see some questions in here. Femme Fatale asks, have you ever found yourself writing and the story takes a turn on its own that you didn't expect? This happens all the time. And I've just kind of come to accept it as part of the process, and actually maybe one of the most fun parts of the process. But when it comes to mapping out Halloween seasons, I'm often starting off pretty vague. I'll have a general idea of what each character, what their arc looks like over the season, but often the exact details of what that means and how that unfolds can change so drastically. And often, especially when we're back here sort of at the start of a new age in the story, or a new era, I guess, it's possible to do what I enjoy doing, which is like finding new perspectives and characters throughout the story as well. I'm not sure that in the first draft of season 4, Raj Greenstreet existed. But then, as the story kind of opens up a need for some characters, then that character appears and they step in and they get to have their spotlight. And sometimes that kind of takes on a life of its own throughout the story. I think most of Clara's classmates in season 2 for the summer camp, which includes Arnold and Victoria and Harrow, these were characters that really didn't. I'm sorry to like let you behind the curtain for Oz, but they didn't necessarily exist until it came down to, okay, it's summer camp time. Who are the other people here? And then beginning to math out what makes each of these characters special and what their complex is and how they fit into the story and what the group dynamic is going to be. And there's a lot of fun in the like creative stuff that you get to do, not just in the planning stage, but throughout the season. And often characters left to their own devices will kind of go to unexpected places. So it is, I think, one of the really fun things about working on a story that is this slow and this long and this lengthy, is that as a writer, I get to kind of not have everything up front, but to discover it in real time as the writing goes on. And it has a bit of a life of its own, and you kind of sort of set it up and then it carries it by itself. And so that's something that I think makes the process quite enjoyable, is that act of discovery as you are writing it out on the page, as opposed to trying to plan out every single detail in advance and then write it exactly to the specifications that you made. The back half of any Hallowoods season usually looks like crossing out the entire rear outline every few episodes and rewriting how everything's going to play out based on what has happened in the last few episodes. These two characters have struck off on their own. They're going in this direction. So that's going to change this, then this, and this. And that's going to set them on a course with this group of characters instead. And so by the end, it usually is a fairly convoluted path that various characters have taken, but it's also one I think that usually is supposed to flow fairly nicely, as it just is continually getting rewritten in the back end to accept and encourage whatever the characters have chosen to do in the present. Certain scenes I usually do have figured out from the start, especially Clementine's last scene facing off with the villains in this season. Was one I think that existed before most of the rest of the season did. But it's always a question of how do we get to that point in the story, and we get to kind of find that in real time. So it often takes turns that I don't expect, but I think that's why I like this particular medium of storytelling so much, is you get to find those things in real time. Whereas if you do it in a book, things can go a way that you don't expect. But then you finish writing it, and then you send it to an agent or an editor. It comes back for revisions. It gets parsed again. It goes back. It comes back for revisions. It gets parsed, and then eventually, when it goes out to the public, it's just sort of one finished work, and it's long done by the time that anyone ever sees it. So one of the fun things here is that if something takes a sudden turn or there's a twist that I wasn't necessarily expecting from the characters, then a week or two later, the audience is also going to get to see that. And then, it is kind of a sort of a shared experience in that way. Let's see. Beanie asks, not so much a question, but can we have a short, vague teaser for season 5? Bonus points if it's funny. Not sure I have one for you. I think there's I would expect some courtroom drama is all I can say at this point. I think there's a couple of genres that we are getting to tap throughout these seasons that we haven't gotten to yet. And that is probably something that I expect to steal some from or get to play with as we get into some of the events of the next season. Grim says, fair in regards to the marketing. That's exactly how I ended up getting a bachelor's in digital media from a state college, more or less. Yeah. So I think that, and feel free to drop any final questions in the chat. But I think that will bring us more or less to the end of our Q&A. So thank you so much, everybody, for continuing to listen to the Hallowoods and to make this show something that gets worked on. It is true that, like, in the current state of it, the only reason I'm able to keep writing and working on these projects is that there are people on the other side listening and supporting the show and making it something that continues to exist week to week. In addition to that, there will be, I think, some upcoming changes that you'll probably see on the patron side over this next couple of weeks. We'll be sort of updating our tiers a little bit as we roll into season 5. We'll be opening up a new merch store with DFTBA. Don't forget to be awesome, which is Hank Green's merch company. And so coming up soon, we'll finally have stuff available over there. And hopefully sort of refresh our collection of patterns, which have been really, most of our merch has been the same for about the last 4 years. So that'll be long overdue. And then lastly, just season 5 coming up around the bend. So until then, enjoy these last couple episodes. Enjoy these last weeks of break. And I'll see you around the bend. Thank you so much, everybody. Toodles.